When the roll is called at the Republican National Convention in 2016, Louisiana Governor Bobby Jindal may or may not be a contender for the presidency. But spend a few minutes with the current Bayou boss and vice chairman of the Republican Governors Association, and you understand that he will be a force to reckon with from this moment until every second when he gets there and when we get there as well. We recently had a chance to talk with the governor in this part of our exclusive interview with Governor Jindal. You understand quickly that he has Obamacare on the mind. It has been one of those issues that he has constantly talked about it, and he is going to make sure that you understand exactly what he thinks. He considers what he believes is a solid plan to bring Obamacare down and replace it with something much more necessary for the American people.
What frustrates me so much is when these candidates run for office, they make all these promises when it's election time, then they come to D.C. and they forget what they promised us. And here's the big challenge coming ahead of us. I think the Supreme Court is likely to rule the correct way. I think they're likely to rule when it comes to Obamacare, the law means what it says. And what that means is in up to 37 states, they could strike down the federal subsidies. That means that the individual mandate, for the most part, is gone. The employer mandate is gone in those states. And that's a huge victory and a huge opportunity to get rid of this awful law. Here's my concern. You've already got Republicans in Washington, D.C. saying we can't really repeal Obamacare. And just like all those other issues you talked about, they're already wanting to give up before the fight starts. They're telling us, well, you can't get rid of all the tax increases, or you need to have another new entitlement program, or we're going to count success by how many people have cards, not really reducing cost and helping the American people be in charge of their own health care. And what I worry about is we don't need a cheaper Democratic Party. We don't need two liberal parties. This election this last year wasn't about getting better office space for Speaker Boehner and Senator McConnell. It was really about standing up for conservative principles. We won elections in red states, blue states, and purple states. One of the most important issues was repealing and replacing Obamacare, and all of it. We don't need Obamacare light. We don't need a cheaper version of that program. We need Republicans in D.C. who will stand up on principle. Now remember, they'll complain it's too hard. Hillary Clinton started with Hillary Care back in the 90s. It took them 16 years, it took them several years to try to take over our health care system, culminating in Obamacare. It may take a little bit of time. It may take us some fight to get rid of Obamacare, to restore our freedom, but we need conservatives in D.C. that are willing to fight the fight. So I am frustrated and I'm disappointed and I'm very worried because there will be a severe backlash. There should be a backlash from the voters. We need to hold these guys accountable.
When it comes down to Obamacare, it is so easy for anybody to say it is time to repeal it. But you just said it. It took years for this version to come into account right now, for it to start getting moving. There are tentacles of Obamacare now throughout the entire nation. So it's easy to say repeal, Governor, but what do you then replace it with? Because that in itself is going to take years to do. So you can't just flip a light switch and all of a sudden you have a brand new health care system.
Well, and the good news is I actually put out a detailed plan last year talking specifically how you replace all of it. And whether Republicans adopt my plan or another plan, I think it's right that we do have an obligation to show how we would replace it. Our plan, there are many moving parts, but it's pretty simple. First, it focuses on reducing cost. Second, it focuses on protecting the vulnerable. And third, it doesn't raise taxes. It doesn't create a new entitlement program. For example, we have to change the tax code. I call for a standard deduction. I allow individuals to buy their health care across state lines through voluntary purchasing pools if they want, so they get the economies of scale. That way, if you switch jobs, if you move, you can afford your health care. We give the states more flexibility, more accountability, but more flexibility in the Medicaid program. Reforms like premium support in the Medicare program. Reforms to crack down on the frivolous lawsuits. There are estimates that have shown that a similar type plan, including similar elements, would decrease premiums by on average $5,000. It would cover, some analyses have shown, about over 9 million people in terms of previously uninsured folks. So there are conservative principles, including health savings accounts and other reforms that actually make sense. It starts with repealing this monstrosity. Here's the fundamental mistake that Republicans in D.C., I think, are making. They're allowing the president to dictate the terms. They're saying, well, if he raises taxes this much, we'll just raise them a little bit less. Or if he creates a new expensive entitlement program, ours will be a little cheaper. That's a mistake. What the American people want is they want affordability. They don't want government bureaucrats between doctors and their patients. What we must not do is snatch defeat out of the jaws of victory. We really have a chance here to repeal this entire awful law. And what I don't understand is when they were campaigning, there was no asterisk in those campaign ads saying we're just going to repeal the easy parts. There was no asterisk, there was no clause, there was no caveats or disclaimers saying we're not going to do this because it's too hard and the Washington media is going to beat us up. I think they need to stand on principle. And the other side, they were determined. They understand what's at stake here in terms of trying to take over our healthcare system. We need to be just as determined fighting for freedom on our side.
You just talked about standing on principles, and you also mentioned the phrase fundamental mistakes. When it comes down to right now at this moment, it would seem to many people that the Republican leadership in Congress has made a tremendous amount of mistakes. You have McConnell, Boehner, they're fighting. Behind closed doors, we have Republicans fighting with the Tea Party. They cannot seem to get their own house in order at this point. So let me ask you this, Governor. Who failed at the leadership, and where is the leadership at this point that if the Republicans are truly going to take hold of Congress, as they promised, and get something done, that they can move it forward and actually stop fighting amongst themselves?
Well, a couple of things. One, I think what happens is folks come to D.C., well-intentioned folks, and all of a sudden they care about what the New York Times says about them, what the Washington Post says about them. Look, if you're a conservative Republican and those editorial pages are saying something good about you, you're probably doing something wrong. And instead of worrying about these folks, the establishment and the media, they need to be worried about the folks that elected them in the first place. I think what Republicans back home are looking for are leaders who are willing to take bold stands, and even if they get criticized by the left or the media, will stand up for their beliefs.
More of our exclusive one-on-one with Louisiana Governor Bobby Jindal comes up later today here on MidPoint, but we do want to follow a developing story right now. You're looking live in Washington, D.C. at the moment. This is the FCC hearing, and the FCC has passed the historic measure to more strictly regulate the Internet. They have passed what is now known as net neutrality. This is something that you need to understand, as things will not change immediately. The FCC rules officially will not be out until perhaps summertime. So then the major telecom companies will challenge the new rules in court. A judge might put the rules on hold. The next president could let this basically just wither away. So in the short term, nothing changes. Streams won't go any faster, no abrupt new high-speed fiber cables in a neighborhood. But the FCC has granted itself the power to defeat the network owners who want to kill what some people call internet freedom by blocking websites. Net neutrality has moved forward according to the FCC. We'll bring you more on this as the day goes on because, quite frankly, again, as we have said so many times, people are wondering, what is it going to do to my cost for the internet? How is that going to improve or degrade what I have? You can check it out and learn more about the story right now. Go to Newsmax.com. You'll see the story there. FCC approves new rules for the future of the internet. It will affect every single one of us, one way or another. Let the new fighting begin. Next up, let's turn to the not-so-extreme nor successful works by the IRS to catch crooks here on MidPoint. There are at the moment several ways to consider fighting the war on global terror. Those who say, take it to the enemy. Others who, like President Obama, believe in quiet talk. And the more laughable segment of the population that wants America to ensure the poorer nations of the world have jobs. And that will solve everything. Louisiana Governor Bobby Jindal is not afraid to spit out his views on what must be done and unafraid of any criticism he gets for the action. Just some of what emerged in our exclusive Straight Up with the man who might indeed be a presidential candidate in 2016.
I gave a speech in London a few weeks ago about the threat of radical Islamic terrorism. Talked about the need for individual Muslims and Muslim leaders to call out individual terrorists by name and condemn not just generic acts of violence, but these individuals, to say these are not martyrs going to enjoy a reward in the afterlife. These terrorists are going straight to hell. And I also said that we've got to say we're at war with radical Islamic terrorism, even though the president doesn't like to use those words. And then secondly, we in the West have to insist on those coming into our societies, into our country, on integration and assimilation. And so in America, if you want to come here, you have to respect the rights of freedom of self-determination for other people. We also should say, by the way, we need to stop calling ourselves hyphenated Americans. We're Americans. We're not African Americans or Asian Americans. We're Americans. That used to be a popular concept. We used to be the melting pot. Now, unfortunately, the politically correct crowd says you can't say that. Some in the left, some in the media try to say that I was anti-Muslim or racist, and that's ridiculous. We need Republicans, we need conservative leaders willing to stand up and tell the truth. This is one of the most serious threats we face, and we've got a president whose administration is saying foolish things like, well, we're not going to win this war by killing our enemies. They're saying things like we need a jobs program, we need better governance for these terrorists. That's nonsense. We need to hunt them down. We need to kill them. So we need conservative Republican leaders that are willing to stand up, tell the truth, even if they get criticized by the New York Times, the Washington Post, the D.C. establishment, the media up here, they need to be willing to fight for those principles. That's what voters want. I think the voters across this country are so frustrated with this president, how radical he is, how liberal he is. You mentioned Keystone. Look, this is a president that is so captured by his radical environmentalist base. He's turning his back on those unions that want those jobs. He's turning his back on Canada. He's turning his back on the American economy, a $5 billion pipeline paid for entirely with private dollars, not borrowed money from China, not federal government money, but private money, diversifies our energy sources, creates more good-paying jobs in our country. We need Republicans and conservatives willing to stand up to this president and say we need a major course correction, not incremental change, but a big change in Washington, D.C. to get our country back on the right track.
Now, because this president cannot or will not say the words such as radical Islamic terrorists, is that why you say that he is unfit to be commander-in-chief?
Absolutely. Look, I think he has disqualified himself, and I don't take any pleasure in saying that. I don't say that for partisan or ideological reasons. One, he won't identify the enemy as radical Islamic terrorism. If you won't call it for what it is, how can we beat this enemy? Secondly, he seems more intent on bringing up things like the Crusades and criticizing America. I'll make a deal with him. I'll keep an eye out for medieval Christians if he will, as commander-in-chief, take the fight to the radical Islamic terrorists and hunt them down and eliminate them. Third, even when he goes to Congress to ask for authorization of use of military force, this is the one time, and I'll never say this, I've never said this before, it's the one time Congress needs to give the president more than what he has asked for. Two changes they need to make in his request. Number one, he sets an arbitrary 3-year deadline. This war is done when we've finished hunting them down and killing them. We can't set some political timeline to appease the left. Secondly, we need to remove his self-imposed ban on ground troops. Now, nobody wants to see ground troops, nobody wants to see that as our first option, but it is ridiculous for our commander-in-chief to go to our military planners and put political constraints on them. He needs to go to the Pentagon, go to our military planners, go to the leaders, the folks in uniform on the ground and say, give me a plan to hunt down, eradicate this threat, tell me what it's going to take to win this war, and he needs to have every tool at his option. He is the first commander-in-chief I can remember who seems to prefer to tell people what we're not going to do as opposed to what we are going to do. So I think Congress, you talked about the need for leadership in Congress. Here's something where Republicans can step up to the plate, hopefully get some Democrats that are worried about this as well, amend this authorization of use of force in those two specific ways. No arbitrary political deadlines or political concessions to the radical left. And it saddens me to say this, but yes, this president has disqualified himself. He showed himself not to be fit to be commander-in-chief. He is not. He won't even, for some reason, doesn't like to say the words radical Islamic terrorism. In some ways, continues to talk as if some of these challenges are matters for the criminal justice system. This is a war, and these are barbarians. They're beheading, they're crucifying, they're torturing, they're killing Christians, Jews, Muslims, religious minorities. We need to hunt them down. We need to kill them. We need a commander-in-chief who understands the grave threat that we face.
Well, Governor, you recently tweeted, and I'm going to point this out, the mission for our military should be clear. Defeat the terrorists. You had signed our petition if you agree. You've been hammered for that tweet by a lot of people on the left and a lot of members of the media. They say it's really easy for Governor Bobby Jindal to make this statement, get out there, defeat the terrorists, but he's not the one out there putting guys and girls on the ground, putting American lives at risk. So how do you answer those who say, Governor, it's easy. You can say defeat it, but all you're doing is just throwing out a couple of words here, and there's nothing really to back it up. How do you answer them?
Look, any American leader should take very seriously the responsibility of sending our troops in harm's way, but let's understand what's at stake here. The short-term threat is ISIS, but the bigger foreign policy threat, this is what really concerns me, is that under this administration, if he allows Iran to become a nuclear power, if he allows them, and I worry that this president's hesitancy to take on ISIS fully may be tied to his desire to get an overarching deal with Iran. And the reason I say that, I believe Turkey would be willing to commit more ground troops, more support, more resources if they were convinced that America was truly committed to removing Assad in Syria. So, for example, in Kobani, you had a great combination of American and allied airstrikes with Kurdish troops on the ground. They were successful in a battle that many commentators thought that ISIS was going to win. It could have been really a war of attrition. There's a model there. If we would be willing to arm the Kurds more successfully, we'd be willing to work with our Turkish allies, the problem is that Turkey is very worried, I believe, that if they were to help take out ISIS, it just strengthens Assad, strengthens Iran. So I worry that this president's desire to get a deal, even if it's a bad deal, I worry if he wants a bad deal greater than no deal, let's be clear, a nuclear-armed Iran is a threat not only to Israel and to our European allies, it's a threat, an existential threat to the United States as well, and it won't stop with Iran.
One thing that comes out in the interview with Governor Jindal is he is very aggressive. He is out there. He is actually, you can hear it in his voice. He is pushing a lot of emotion. He is pushing his actions, his reactions, his thoughts, and what he believes the nation should do in 2016 and beyond. It's a little bit unlike some politicians who might lie back a little bit, but the governor is taking things head on. He's also taking a lot of opponents on head on as well. Want to point out that we had a chance to talk with him exclusively. Another part of our interview will air tomorrow, Friday, right here on MidPoint, and the governor will finally get down to talking a little bit about 2016 and what he would do or might do if indeed he would get a chance to become president. Got to put everything in those, you've got to couch it just like that, because that's the way we get to 2016. All right, the governor, we rely heavily on the internet, broadband, we all do for doing business. We got to talk about that and a whole lot more coming up next.